We're going to be going over the preferences that you can set in QuickBooks Desktop. A lot of these preferences I find clients don't realize it's something you can turn on or off or change, and they might be getting frustrated by it or annoyed. So I like to go through these just to make you aware that they are something you can change or set to make your life a little bit easier. To find preferences, you're going to go up to Edit on the menu bar and Preferences. And when the window opens, you're going to see a list of topics down the left-hand side. And then each topic is going to have two tabs on the right-hand side, a My Preferences tab and a Company Preferences tab. The My Preferences tab is going to only affect your user login. So if you have more than one person logging into QuickBooks, more than one user, these are only going to affect you and not the other users. Company Preferences are going to affect everybody who logs into the file. So most of you only have one user. For those that do have more than one user, just keep that in mind when you do change something on either of these tabs. Keep in mind how that may or may not affect other users. I'm going to start here at the top of this list, which is accounting. And I'm going to go through kind of what I recommend for townships. And some things are personal preferences and some things I would just recommend. So I would recommend having the autofill memo on the journal entry checked. On the Company Preferences tab, we are going to use account numbers. We want it to require accounts so that we can't leave that field empty. On the class section, we are going to have both of these checked if you are using classes to track your funds. Go ahead and have to automatically assign the journal entry numbers and warn when posting a transaction to retained earnings or your fund balance. We don't want to post directly to fund balance. These date warnings are nice to have turned on. You can change the number of days on here. So it's going to warn if you try to post a transaction that is 90 days in the past or 30 days in the future. This is really helpful, especially when the new year rolls around and you're not used to typing the new year and you end up typing last year and it's more than 90 days in the past. It'll warn you that that's an old transaction to help you catch dating errors. So I do recommend having these turned on, but you can set the number of days as needed. The closing date is really important. So a closing date is how we lock the books so that we don't accidentally make changes. A lot of systems, a lot of accounting systems will make you roll from period to period so that you can't change the prior period. And QuickBooks doesn't have a hard roll like that or a hard close. So you can actually post to any date at any time unless you have closed that date. The way we close it is you come into closing date here and set a date and password. You can choose any date that you want to close the books. And basically what will happen is if you choose a date, like let's say we put June 30th, if you try to change or add a transaction that is dated June 30th or before, it's going to warn you that those books are closed. You can still change it, but it's going to warn you and make you think twice about it. I do recommend also putting in a password. So then what will happen is it's going to warn you that the books are closed, and then you say, okay, and then it will ask you, okay, then enter the password to do so. I recommend putting a password in here. Write it down. You do need access to it. I usually joke with my clients and tell them that I make the closing date password $1,000, $1000. And it's sort of a joke between us and for me to say, if you enter the closing date and go back and change something that's already been closed, it's going to cost you $1,000 for me to come in and fix it. So it's sort of a joke, but it helps people kind of stop and think when they see that password and they go, oh, wait, Katie said not to do this. So enter a closing date password, whatever you would like. You enter it twice here. Choose your closing date. I recommend closing at least once a month. I close the books when I reconcile the bank statements. You might want to close twice. You could close once at the end of the month when you reconcile the bank statements for that month. And you might want to do it again if you run your board reports from board meeting to board meeting date. You might want to close the books after you print those checks from the board meeting so that you don't post something prior to a board meeting date. So that's found under the Company Preferences, set date and password. You can also find the closing date. I'm going to cancel out of here from the company menu, set closing date. We'll take you right back into that screen. It's just a little bit faster to access. Most townships are not going to be using the bills and bills payment. There are two ways to make payments in QuickBooks. So there's a two-step process, which is a bill and a bill payment. And then there's a one-step process using the write checks feature. 99% of the time, I'm going to recommend using the write checks feature, which means that any of these bill settings are not applicable. The calendar is, let me show you where that is first. I'm going to cancel out of the preferences. Calendar, there is usually a shortcut on the icon bar already provided for it right here. You can also access it from the company menu if you don't have a shortcut for it. The calendar is going to show all the activity that you have done. Now this is a sample file. Let me see what I've got in here. So what we can see here is on the 26th, I had entered 7 different items, and here they are. So if you're trying to look at what did I do yesterday, or did I do that last week, this might be a fast way for you to find something. In the calendar settings, you can also do add some to-dos over here. They'll be listed on this side. That will show up in the reminders and a little bit later. I'm going to close the calendar, go back into Edit, Preferences, and back to the calendar settings. So here's where you can change some of the things and how they show up on the calendar. I personally don't use the calendar a whole lot, so I don't change these, but feel free to play around with it. The checking area on the My Preferences tab is where you can set the default accounts to use when you are writing checks, paying bills, sales tax, or deposits. Most townships are not going to be using the pay bills or the pay sales tax lines, so you can just keep those unchecked. But for writing checks and make deposits, you'll want to select your default account, the one you use most often to write checks and make deposits. If you don't select the default, QuickBooks will automatically remember which one you used last time. It's called a sticky field, where it remembers which one you used last time. So it'll be a sticky field unless you set the default. So I do recommend setting those to your checking accounts. On the company preferences, I would have print the account names on the voucher. This is the check stub that prints underneath your checks. And that's really helpful, especially for the auditors. If you have a check stub that you've torn off and put with the copy of the bill in your files, it's helpful to have the account name on there for when you're looking up where that was coded later. I don't like to have this one checked. I don't want it to be changing dates that I've already entered. Start with the payee field on a check. When you are creating checks in QuickBooks, it's automatically going to start with the date field, and some people prefer it to start with the payee field. So you can change which field it starts with. If it bothers you that it always starts up at the date, then you can come here and change it and make it start on the payee. We do want it to warn about duplicate check numbers, and we do want to autofill the payee account number in the check memo. If the vendor has an account number, for example, your utility account or your cell phone bill is going to have an account number on it, you can put that in the vendor profile for their account number, and then when you have this checked, it will autofill that account number on the memo line of your check. So that's a good setting to have checked. Here's where we select the default accounts to use for payroll to create paychecks or pay the payroll liabilities. And bank fees are generally not used for townships. These are mostly available with the major national banks, and I find that most townships bank locally. And I don't really find it helpful for townships to use the bank feeds. Desktop view. On the My Preferences, some of these are available from the View menu from our previous video. You can change it to having one window open all the time or multiple windows. That's also available from the View menu up here on your menu bar. Your desktop. If you have Save When Closing Company checked, what will happen is whatever windows you have open in QuickBooks, when you close it, will reopen next time you open the company. That might be really helpful if you like to pick up where you left off. I don't like that because I have a bad habit of leaving too many windows open. So I don't want to wait for QuickBooks to open the 15 windows I had open last time because I forgot to close them. So I generally have Don't Save the Desktop checked. The other options here are Save the Current Desktop. So let's say you find yourself always using the same 3 windows, and you want QuickBooks to always open those 3 windows when you open the file. Have those 3 windows open and click Save Current Desktop and then click OK. And then it will save what you currently have open. When you come back into these preferences, this option will now be checked saying keep previously saved desktop. So keep the previously saved one means we've already saved a certain list of windows we want open every time QuickBooks open. If you want to change which windows are open, maybe you want 4 windows open. You would open that 4th window, come in, click Save Current Desktop, and click OK again. Again, my preference is don't save the desktop. I do prefer to have the home page open when I'm opening a company file. So when you open, it's going to land on the home page. That's nice to have. And if you have a top icon bar, it's going to default to a dark background. And we did this in another video where you can switch it. I'm going to uncheck this, and you can see it switches to a dark background. I think that's just a little bit harder to see. So I do prefer to have the light background on those. These are Windows settings for your display and sound. If you click these, it'll open up your Windows settings. And you can change the color of your file. If you don't like the default dark blue, you can change it to green or pink or whatever you like. Some people find that really helpful if you work in more than one company file to change the colors to help you catch which file you're working in. On company preferences, most of these should be turned off. All this down here, estimates, sales tax, sales orders, inventory, and time tracking should all be off. These control what shows up on your home page, and we generally, for townships, are not using sales receipts, statements, or pay bills and enter bills, so I have those unchecked. Finance charges are, and I guess I should have demonstrated that. So when you make any change, I'm gonna change this again, and you click out of here, whether you're clicking to another topic or you click OK, it's going to tell you, you made changes. Do you wish to save them? And if you do want to save them, you can click yes. If you did not mean to make changes, you can click no. Finance charges, you generally won't be using this as if you were charging your customers finance charges for late payments to you, and that's generally not applicable to townships. On the General tab here, on My Preferences, pressing Enter moves between fields. I prefer to have this unchecked. So when it's unchecked, pressing Enter is going to record the transaction. And to move between the fields on the screen, you can use your Tab key, or you can click with your mouse. I prefer to tab between the fields, and then Enter records the transaction. But if you like pressing Enter between fields, that's fine. You can check this checkbox. It is nice to have the automatic drop-down lists when you start typing. So when you're typing a vendor name, you start typing it, and then it will the drop-down will pop up, and you can see all your available options. The beep when recording a transaction, so this sometimes annoys people, but I find it helpful. Sometimes, very rarely, you can accidentally record something and not realize it. Maybe you had a screen open and didn't realize it, and you bump a button and it records something. It's very rare, but it has happened to me a few times. And so I like to have that beep on, and basically what happens every time you post a transaction, it'll beep. And that's just like a audio warning to you. If it does beep and you didn't mean to record something, it helps you realize, oh, whoops, I did not mean to save that. So I do like having that turned on. Automatically placing the decimal point, that's a personal preference. If you want to be able to type, if you're typing $25, if you just want to type 25 and move on to the next field, then we're going to have this unchecked. If you have this checked and you type 25, it's going to automatically place the decimal point two digits in, and it'll be 25 cents. And so if you have this checked and you want to type $25, you would have to type 2500, and then it would place the decimal point. So that's personal preference on how you like to key in your numbers. We do want it to warn when editing a transaction. It just helps us catch errors if we don't mean to change something. Bring back all one-time messages. If you are a new user of QuickBooks, I do recommend turning this one on. What happens is QuickBooks gives you messages when you do something for the first time, just a little notification. And what happens is over time, people check, please don't show me this again, or turn it off. And when you have a new user, it is helpful to see those again for the first time. So if you come in and check this, bring them back, then you will see all those one-time messages as a new user. And again, you can turn them off as they pop up and you read them, but I do find that helpful. I would turn off pop-up messages. This is where QuickBooks is going to sell you different products and services. I would turn those off. Tooltips for clips text, I would show that if you hover over something. it will show you any, if the description is too long to fit in the field, if you hover over it, it'll show. I find that helpful. And then also warn when deleting a transaction. Automatically recall information. I actually have this one turned off. Some people might say, well, why? Don't you want it to autofill your expense account when you're paying your utility bill? I do, but let me explain. There's a better way to do it. In the vendor profile, when you're setting up a vendor, you can tell QuickBooks which expense accounts you use for that vendor. So if you're setting up your cell phone provider, Verizon or AT&T or whoever that is, in the vendor area, you can tell it, I always want this to go to telephone expense. Or if it's your utility provider, you want that to go to your utility expense or your insurance. So I set that up in the vendor profile. I don't like it to automatically remember what I did last time, because sometimes, what if it was a one-time change? For example, normally you're paying a utility company for utilities, but one time you had some project going on and you had to pay them for some sort of capital outlay, and that might cause you to code future transactions to the wrong area. So I have this turned off, and also sometimes people find it confusing because it will even pull in the last dollar amount that you paid. And that can be very confusing when you pull up the vendor and it pre-fills the dollar amount and you're going, wait, where did that dollar come from? Did I enter it? Did they enter it? So again, have this unchecked. And if you want QuickBooks to know which expense accounts you use for a particular vendor, set that up in the vendor profile. A default date for new transaction, again, a personal preference. Do you want it to always have today's date come up as the default or the last entered date? So if you have the last entered date, that's going to be what's called a sticky field, and remember what you did last time. If you're entering all your checks and you're dating them, say for the board meeting date, you're probably going to want to use this last entered date so you don't always have to change the date of your check each time you enter a check to the board meeting date. If you're always dating everything today, then you can use today. So you can change it. It's just the default that populates when you first open things. And we don't keep custom item information for townships, so this down here is not applicable. This is where you can change your time format. This is going to show up when you enter your payroll hours to do paychecks. Do you prefer to enter your time in hours and minutes, or do you prefer to enter them as a decimal? So you can see here, it's either going to be 10 hours and 12 minutes or 10.2 hours. Again, a personal preference. Sometimes you like that to match your time tracking system. I do like to have the 4-digit dates. Have this one unchecked. Never update name information when saving transactions. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you get a bill from Joe's Lawn Care, and they have a new mailing address you need to change that you need to send their check to. As you're writing the check, you can change the address on the check. And then when you save that transaction, it will update the vendor profile so that next time we're sending it to the correct place. If you have this checked, never update the name information. It will not save that new address to the vendor profile. It would allow you to change the address the one time, but then you would have to change it again in the vendor profile later. I find it's very rare where I would want to change the address one time and not want it to update through the vendor information. So I usually have this unchecked. And I do recommend having saved transactions before printing. We generally don't want to print something that hasn't been posted to the system. The login settings, I generally have log off every time. I don't want it to keep me logged in for several days or any period of time. You should have to log in every time you open the company. Integrated applications are going to be applications that are talking to QuickBooks. You probably have nothing here. This particular company file does have a few things connected that I have used to connect to talk with QuickBooks through different software. So there aren't any my preferences on this one, only company preferences. But if there are things here that you don't recognize, you should probably come in and remove them. But talk with your QuickBooks consultant before you remove things. Items and inventory. Townships don't use this. This is not the same as your road district has to track inventory for the auditor, which is generally just their tools and equipment and vehicles. That's not what it's talking about here. So this is not applicable to townships. Jobs and estimates, again, not applicable to townships. This would think about, this is for contractors who send estimates to people before they do a job. Multiple currencies, we are not going to be using this. I find that townships very rarely do anything with multiple currencies. This is one thing, never ever turn it on, because once it's on, you cannot turn it off. And even if you buy something, let's say you buy something that happens to be in Canadian dollars or pounds, you order it online and it was in a different currency, that's fine. We can still enter it with US dollars. Don't turn on the multiple currencies. Payments, this is if customers or people were paying you with credit cards or electronic payments, and they're not. Usually you do receive electronic deposits for replacement taxes or property taxes, and that's set up through your county or through the state. This is usually not applicable to townships. Payroll and employees, on the company preferences tab, this is where you can turn things on and off. You can see this particular one, I have manual payroll set, which means I'm not paying for a payroll subscription. I would have to manually calculate their paychecks. Here's where you can change the pay stub and voucher printing, and it just you can check and uncheck what you want to show or not show on the pay stub for employees. Workers' comp, I wouldn't mess with that. You're going to start getting sales calls from Intuit regarding work comp insurance. And sick and vacation. If you have paid time off for any of your employees and you would like to track the balances in QuickBooks, this is where you set up the policies, how they accrue. Is it the beginning of the year? Do they earn hours on every paycheck? How many hours do they get? Is there a maximum? Do they roll over? How many? And then you can have this also print on their pay stub. I find it real helpful to use, especially if you have a road crew that has hours to use and they're kind of always wondering how much they have left. Those are usually the ones I see most often that have PTO hours available. If your policy does not fit these parameters, for example, you accrue in a way that is not, you cannot enter here, I would recommend changing your policy to match something on here just to make your life easier. Just because QuickBooks can't fit your policy doesn't mean we can't change the policy. So keep that in mind. If it'll make your life easier, don't be afraid to change how your hours accrue or your PTO hours are earned so that you can utilize QuickBooks for this. I don't like to have the earnings details or quantity fields or hours on the paychecks. I don't want it to remember what happened last time. To me, again, I find that confusing when I go in to pay payroll and I see hours for an employee and I think, why are those there? Is that what I entered for this pay period or is that last pay period? So I would rather start with a clean slate. It will remember salary employees. It will remember all the withholdings you have set up. This is just specifically talking about your quantities, your hours that you're entering for your hourly employees. And if you are using class tracking, we do recommend having the class tracking turned on, and you're going to do it from an entire paycheck. We don't want to do earnings items. It does not work as you might think. So definitely job costing for class if you're using classes for your funds, and do the entire paycheck. If you need to split an employee between funds, for example, you have an employee who's paid from both town and road, we recommend paying them from one fund, let's say town, and then a road reimburse town for a portion of those wages. If it's half, and you might even do that once a year to keep things easy. It does not have to happen every pay period, whatever's easiest for you. Your employee list is either going to sort by first name or last name. You can change that in here. And neither the sales reps is not applicable to townships. And generally, we don't want social security numbers printing on our reports. We can still access them. We just don't want them to print on most of our reports. Reminders, this is QuickBooks built-in to-do list where you can have it remind you to do things. If you see up here in the very upper right-hand corner, there's a little alarm clock looking icon, and then there's a 2. This is telling me I have 2 reminders set up, or that it automatically created 2 reminders for me, most likely. Reminders are also available to view in that calendar view we looked at earlier. So if you would like QuickBooks to remind you to do certain things, you can come in here and change these settings. Reports and graphs. When you open a report, it will open as the default report that's been set up. If you would rather it ask you the report settings, the report parameters before it opens, you can check this button to prompt me to modify the report. I don't like having this checked, but some people do. Again, this is a personal preference. If you find yourself customizing a lot of reports, which we'll discuss later on how to customize. If you find yourself clicking customize a lot, you might want to have this pop up, which would prompt you to customize before the report even generates. I like to have my reports and graphs refresh automatically rather than asking me if they want to refresh. This would be if you had a report open and you went and posted another check or another deposit. You want your report to reflect that automatically, and not have to do anything to refresh that report. So I have refresh automatically marked. Graphs are not generally used by townships. On the company preferences tab, most smaller townships especially are going to be cash. You may be accrual basis, and you might want to talk to your auditor about which one of these you should use. Most of the time it's going to be cash. Townships are not going to be using aging reports unless you are using the bills and bill payment feature. On reports, I generally have name and description is fine. We aren't generally using items in townships. Accounts, I have name only is my preference, and we don't use statement of cash flows in townships. The default formatting for reports, if you want to change, you can uncheck the default and change the format of your reports. If you find that the QuickBooks reports are too small, the font sometimes can be very small for people. This is where you can come in and change the default font. Let's say you always want it to be a size 10. I want to say it's an 8 or a 9 on some of the smaller lines, which can be very small for people to read. If you want it to print larger, here's where you can come in and change your default formatting so it'll always display at a larger font. Your sales and customers, we don't generally use for townships. Sales tax, I don't recommend tracking in QuickBooks. Even if you have, sometimes townships have an enterprise fund, such as a pool where they sell concessions and you are collecting sales tax. I still don't recommend turning it on in QuickBooks. It just creates more complications than is necessary. There's easier ways to track it. Your search settings are for this little search bar in the upper right-hand corner. So you can turn that on and off on the My Preferences tab, whether or not you even want to see that search field. And I'd like to have it on, and you can choose. You can either have it search the company file, which would be, let's say you want to search for a check number or a dollar amount or a date or a vendor name. You could search the QuickBooks Desktop help, which would be something like, how do I reconcile the bank statement, or how do I void a check? Or you can let me choose each time I search. So you could search for either of those things. I could put a check number up here. I could put void check up here to get some help article. And when you type it in and click search, it'll ask, do you want to search the company file for this, or do you want to search the help menus? So I like to have it let it choose, just to keep this help bar as dynamic as possible. And on the company preferences, just have this update automatically. Send forms. We aren't generally sending forms from QuickBooks. We do send reports. I do talk about how to email reports directly from QuickBooks, but that's not the same as forms. So most of these are not applicable to townships. Service connections, again, not applicable to townships. Spelling, if you have, if you keep getting spell check errors on when you're creating stuff, and usually it's only going to be maybe when you do a check or a deposit. For example, you're getting a spell check error on somebody's last name or something, you can come in and just turn off spell check if that's not important to you, or you can add people to the, add a custom word, say it's a last name that keeps giving you an error. You can come in and add them to your dictionary. 1099s are down here. So on the company preferences tab, for 1099s, you have to tell QuickBooks 3 different places to do your 1099s. The first one is we have to turn them on and say, yes, we file 1099s here. Then when you set up a vendor, you tell QuickBooks which vendors will receive a 1099, and there's a checkbox in the vendor profile and a place to enter their FEIN or their social security number. And then the third thing you have to do is tell QuickBooks which accounts you want to report on the 1099. So only services are reportable on a 1099, not products. So let's say, for example, you're paying me for accounting services, and those services you paid me for are reportable on a 1099. But let's say I also sold you a computer. Well, the computer is not reportable on a 1099. You would only have to report the amount you paid for services. And what we would tell QuickBooks is any items, any expenses coded to the professional services expense do need to be reported on a 1099. But items like capital outlay, such as the computer example I just gave, would not be reported. So we've marked me and the vendor that I'm receiving a 1099, and we're marking that only payments coded to professional services or rent or a few other line items are reportable on the 1099. And lastly, on time and expenses, generally I'd have this off for townships. Most townships are tracking their hours on a piece of paper with a time clock there at the township building. And so I have this turned off, but you will still be able to enter the hours for the total hours for the pay period for the employee, but we don't generally track and add up the time within QuickBooks here. Those are the preferences available in QuickBooks. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us at redmondaccountingsolutions.com.